This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On Air.
Kia ora, assalamu alaikum, welcome to another episode of Headscarves and Good Yarns. Now, this episode is going to be, I hope it's going to be disruptive, even though the topic is something that is soft. And I'm talking about compassion here. And not just compassion as like an aesthetic or a vibe, but what does compassion look like as politics and resistance and survival? Because I agree, compassion is something that is soft, right? It is yielding. It is, I feel like when I visually think about compassion, it's something that allows for more space and more grace, and it allows more empathy and curiosity. And I feel like when we talk about compassion, it's usually as a vibes or an aesthetic thing, but I think compassion can be soft and disruptive at the same time, because there is space for compassion when it comes to politics and resistance and survival. And I think compassion is quite disruptive when we think about the fact that we're going through an empathy recession. Because if you think about it, most people, I feel like, scrolling on our phones features some part in our morning routine. So even before we've really properly started our day, we're scrolling into, war and genocide, climate disasters, cost of living crisis, violence in the, unfortunately, many forms that it shows up as, mental health emergencies, algorithmic outrage. Like, it unfortunately never ends. And I feel like, one of three things tends to happen, which is A, we feel too much and burn out. B, we feel nothing and detach. Or C, we become so desensitized to suffering and violence and war that it turns into some weird kind of like content. And that's something definitely that I can relate to. I think for me, it's the feeling too much and burning out, like feeling numb or like overwhelmed. And I think it's really important that we talk about how to deal with that, because I don't think, however you feel in response to seeing all of these things, I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with it, but being able to talk about it, I think will help us a lot in making sure that we don't buy into this empathy recession. So, clever man James Baldwin, once wrote, "It is certain that ignorance, allied with power, is the most ferocious enemy justice can have." And I would like to add a little bit to that, especially in our world, which is so driven by social media. And so I would like to add that numbness allied with power is just as dangerous, because when you think about it, when empathy shrinks, politics, it just turns brittle, because policies lose their human face, communities fracture, identity becomes an armor, solidarity becomes performance. So I think the whole thing with this episode is going to be talking about compassion as a strategy and as something that can be disruptive. Because I think another connotation with like compassion being soft, there's always this connotation of things that are softer are weak, that I know that compassion is not a weakness. It is very much a strength. And I think when I think about how compassion can be disruptive, or how it can be an action, it just makes me think of what Bell Hooks said about love. And I know we're talking about compassion here, but I think it's very relevant. So our girl Bell said, love is an action, never simply a feeling. So how can we talk about compassion and reframed it as an action and not just a feeling, and something that we deliberately practice in a world that trains us not to? Because if you think about it, we are really living in an empathy recession. So I really wanted to start with, the empathy recession to begin with. And I think something about empathy that it was also a surprise to me when I was doing research for this episode as well. But when I thought about it, I'm like, that's actually so true. Empathy, I think when we initially think about empathy, it's like something that, because we're all humans, we automatically have for each other. And it's like, maybe we haven't exactly walked in those shoes, but I think we can appreciate how difficult it would be for someone else. But the thing about empathy is that it's actually quite fragile and really biased. So apologies if I'm saying this last name incorrectly, but Jean Desetti, a social neuroscientist, has done decades of research on empathy and how it actually works in the brain. And I think one of the most confronting findings from his research is that empathy is not evenly distributed. So in the research, in the experiments, participants were shown images of people in pain, and their brains lit up far more strongly when the person suffering shared their race, shared their nationality, or was framed as innocent or deserving. But when that same suffering person was framed as foreign or politically opposed, criminal or morally suspect, the empathy dropped significantly and sharply. And when you think about this research, it is not surprising, because then you think about how refugee suffering becomes a policy debate, how poverty gets moralized. I think this research shows that empathy can conflict with justice, and you can see how it's possible to feel deeply for one person or a particular community while ignoring thousands. And so, I think the way that we talk about empathy and the way that we are raised to practice empathy, it's talked about as if it's like this never-ending well which everyone has access to, and everyone is deserving. Like, everyone should be able to drink from that water. I hope that metaphor makes sense. But I think this research shows that actually, the water in that well is not fed. It's not distributed to everyone. And I think empathy should be talked about in a way where it's paired with moral reasoning and systems thinking, because it's not something that's automatic. I think that's where I was trying to go with that wild metaphor about the well. But compassion is not automatic, and it can be cultivated against bias. And, even just for yourself while you're listening to this, just think about it for yourself. Reflect on a time where you notice people care differently depending on who was suffering. And if you take this kōrero outside of yourself, you can see that in the news and in our media and in social media, that compassion and empathy is really for select people or select communities. And you can see that in who does and doesn't get humanized. And, compassion fatigue is a real thing. So research on compassion fatigue at first focused on nurses and trauma workers. And it showed that repeated exposure to suffering without any agency, it leads to emotional blunting, it leads to depersonalization, it leads to cynicism. And so think about how if that is happening on the front line, you can see how that happens in online spaces as well, because now we're living in a day and age where you're scrolling on, it could be any platform, TikTok, Instagram, whatever platform you're using, you're scrolling and in the same session, you are looking at bombings and evictions and violence and genocide as casually as this is the recipe that I made for dinner tonight, and this is my outfit of the day. And I think, it's a fine line, right? Because we shouldn't shy away from the reality that we're looking at, but also we have to be careful of images, especially when it's in a fast-paced social media online setting where those images and videos can become a spectacle rather than a call to action or prompting people to act in solidarity. And even though Black Mirror is just a show, sometimes there are things that happen. I'm like, oh my gosh, you can absolutely see that happening. And there are quite a few Black Mirror episodes where tragedy becomes entertainment and morality becomes reaction content. And so you can see how social media can be an empathy hostile environment. And when we lack eye contact or tone or bodily presence, our empathy circuitry can weaken. And you can see how algorithm, which is just a monster in itself, the algorithm. It can amplify. My gosh, that was apparently a tongue twister for me. But it can amplify rage and fear and humiliation and certainty, because these are the emotions that keep us engaged. This is what feeds the algorithm machine. And so, there was a paper that described digital cruelty and moral fatigue as not bugs, but features. And I think it's really important to be open and honest about, what's happening and what's going on. And it is really important to keep up with what's happening in the world, because we are all connected with each other. But I think, we are never meant to metabolize endless pain alone. And I think that's something that happens on our online spaces, and that our online spaces feature heavily in our day-to-day life. And when it gets to that point where you're metabolizing endless pain, it doesn't actually invite compassion and empathy. It invites disengagement. And when that happens, you can see how we're in an empathy recession at the moment. And, when you think about the algorithm as well that amplifies rage and that fear, anger spreads faster than joy, and despair spreads faster than nuance. So you can see how one violent video can instigate thousands, millions of reactions. There's then the algorithm machine comes and amplifies it, and then we have emotional saturation. And so, what I'm trying to say is that this empathy recession it's not a personal failure. I ain't coming for anyone's necks at the moment, but it is a structural exhaustion, and an exhaustion that is maintained by social media, just our media in general. And I think that's why these days politics is feeling harsher and colder. And I think a really key part of that is how algorithms, they reward moral certainty, not moral curiosity. So you can, I'm sure you've felt it yourself, and research also shows that social platforms amplify out-group hostility, so it really further feeds that us versus them. It amplifies absolutist language, so, no room for nuance, no room to talk things out, to understand each other. It's either this or that. It really feeds that binary even more. And it also amplifies humiliation. So nuance does not really have a home on our media platforms. And it would be, I think, naive to ignore how emotions help all of us organize our own political worlds. And I'm not saying that it's necessarily a bad thing, but when we're living in a time where we're living in an empathy recession, we're becoming desensitized to everything that we see, it then gets into a slippery slope, and we get to a scary place where fear draws borders, disgust creates hierarchy, anger creates enemies. And so when we're all living in a space like this, it just, instead of being led with compassion and empathy and curiosity, we're being fed to choose sides quickly. And I say sides with air quotes, even though you can't see me. It trains us to harden our identity. And I think that is really dangerous because, say this is where you land on a particular topic or issue or value, there's always something valuable in constantly questioning your position, and there's always value in always learning and not having that as a fixed thing. And I'm not saying that it means you will change your mind. You might still land on the same conclusion, but then you could have that extra insight of analyzing the system even more, or expanding the way that you think to include more people who just don't look like you. Because I think one thing that I've really learnt and noticed, especially in the past 5 to 8 years, is that you could have all of these people involved in a kaupapa, but just because you're all there for this kaupapa, it doesn't mean you all think the same way, or you got to the same conclusion the same way. And so you have different levels of analysis on the topic at hand. And I feel like I noticed this. It can be a good thing, but I feel like I've noticed it a lot because it has been, a problem is not the right word, but for the lack of a better word, I will just use the word problem. But I've noticed it as a problem. And it's definitely something that I've mentioned before on the show, but when all of the stuff about Black Lives Matter really, the whole world was on flames talking about Black Lives Matter in 2020. And, so many different kinds of people showed up for the kaupapa. But because there were people who came into the kaupapa and hadn't really thought about things deeply or kind of analyzed their lived experience and how they understand it all. They definitely still had some, even though it was well-intentioned, but like just harmful behavior and harmful things that were said that were still really aligned with like white supremacy. And I don't even think they realized it, but it just goes to show that like you can have a certain identity and still, or, land somewhere on a particular issue and still not 100% understand the big picture or what's going on, or understand the root cause of it. And so that's why I think it's really important that we don't harden our identity, or like it's stand on business and say something with your chest, but also be open to like always revisiting that and questioning that and learning, because there is always something to learn. But we are living in a time where our media encourages us to harden our identity. And it also trains us to perform righteousness. And I think what would be amazing for all of us, regardless of how you think about the world, is that we should be consuming media in a way where it asks us to analyze systems and to hold contradictions. Because that's the other thing, like when I say nuance and things are so complicated and layered, like so many things can be true at the same time. And I think those contradictions is what holds people back from moving forward in curiosity and empathy and being dedicated to like having that hard conversation. For example, just when I go through the comments section of it doesn't even have to be stuff. Could be RNZ, could be Facebook, it could be Reddit. And the things that people bring up, it's like, well, this is what I've experienced in my life. So, racism surely cannot exist, or this is just not how it is. And most of the time it's like, both of those things can be true. Like, yes, your life can be hard. It's not to say like if you have the privilege and the power, it doesn't automatically mean that life is going to be amazing for you. And it doesn't automatically mean that like, life will be handed to you on a gold plate. It's just to say that there are certain barriers that you'll never have to break through because you do have that power and privilege. But it's like there's no space for those contradictions or those multiple truths to be held. And I think that's what we need to be consuming content in a way where there is space for that to be held. And another thing that I think is really important that I wish the way that we consumed media would have more time and space for is staying relational, because that will always remind us of how connected we are to each other, and that's really, really important. And even though this could be considered an extreme example, but when you think about like the way that we consume media and just like we just casually consume images and videos of the most horrific violence, and if you kind of like translate that to the Hunger Games, you can see how the capital survives by emotional spectacle and division. And, it may seem like an extreme example, but you can see how those like base ingredients of emotional spectacle and division really feed into this empathy recession that we're living in. And, when we get to that space, you can see how activism can become a performance, like, movements like the Black Lives Matter, kaupapa, climate justice, Palestine solidarity, they are morally very serious. But online, it's very easy for it to become hashtags and black squares and influencer tears. And And another thing that I want to add to the list, because I'm like, yo, how is this even happening? This is so strange. Or like, then we have like like activist celebrities, and then like we kind of get caught up as a society in the parasocial relationship with that like activist who's somehow become a celebrity. It's very strange. And as I'm saying that, I'm really not talking about anyone specific, but it's just something that I've noticed, and I really want to add that to the list, because these kaupapas are morally very serious, but online it somehow gets translated into all the things that I've just listed. And if you think about like back to 2020, which is strange to say that was like almost 6 years ago now. Corporations were posting statements and influencers cried on camera, but the policy change lagged. Like the online movement or progression didn't translate into real life impacts. And so, I think when something becomes a performance instead of practice, it loses power. And I think another thing that this empathy recession does is that moral outrage replaces moral imagination. It's a lot easier to be outraged than to listen or to grieve or to change behavior. And, outrage can give identity and belonging and clarity. And you can see how that happens in our online spaces. But that outrage has definitely translated into real life. If you think about, these groups that are now coming through, these extremist right-wing groups that seem to get together because they want to get rid of immigrants or go back to segregation days. Like, it's insane. So you can see how outrage can give a sense of identity, belonging, and clarity. But none of that is like transformation. And I think the scary thing about that is that identity can then become some kind of archetype. Online politics turns people into either a victim or a villain or an ally or an oppressor. Oh my gosh. But humans are more complex. And, I think there's danger with rigid identities, because they can become prisons in some way. And so I think our systems confuse anger with care. Anger burns fast, but care sustains. And if there's no empathy or compassion, there is no care. So I really wanted to talk about what can compassionate politics look like. And I think, empathy, it would be naive of us to assume that it's some kind of moral value that is automatic, because empathy is biased. And compassionate politics, it asks us to have moral reasoning, to think about it systematically, to take different perspectives. And so, we need to be really thoughtful about it, because thoughtlessness can enable harm. So I think instead of feel, post, and then collapse, which is a cycle I think social media really encourages, we need to practice think, feel, act. And so I think a core component to compassionate politics is relational accountability. And so a lot of this is borrowed from restorative justice, but the core ingredients of listening and repair and transformation. So, instead of cancellation, we can ask, what does healing look like here? What does learning look like here? Because I think when we ask those questions, it allows room for growth and vulnerability and repair. I think another core component of compassionate politics is emotional hygiene. If we think about the fatigue we feel from social media, it correlates with depression and loneliness and exhaustion. And I think what we need, if we want to navigate social media better, is we need boundaries, which provides safety, really. We need digital fasting. Do we really need to be on social media first thing in the morning? Do we need to have it while we're eating, all three of our meals? Is there something else that we can do for ourselves? Because consuming around the clock, it is not healthy. And I'm not saying this coming from a high place. Okay, y'all, it's something that I definitely need to work on for myself as well. Like, for example, today I got a notification that my average screen time last week was 6 hours. That is concerning, because where did I even find time for those 6 hours? The way that I was working last week, it makes no sense how I even managed to find 6 hours. I must have not slept or something. I don't know. But even then, it's crazy. So when I saw that notification, and even before I got that notification, to be honest, I acknowledged it myself. I was like, I was on my phone too much last week. And it just wasn't good for me, because it wasn't like it was just not healthy. It was just not healthy. We'll put a period on that. But part of resistance is rest. And I think with social media, it is even more important to rest. And I think the last thing that I want to say about compassionate politics is that, it is really important to know what's going on in the world, because everything is connected. Even just talking about what's happening in America right now with the ICE agents, regardless of, how you think about it or where you land, it does pull on strings on other areas of the world, because we're talking about how immigrants are seen. We're talking about racism, all these things that not just localized to America, it's everywhere in the world. And so I think for that reason, it is really important to know what's happening around the world, because everything is connected. But also at the same time, it is a-okay to start with your own world. You can start with caring locally. You can start with your family and friends, curating the spaces to talk about these things. And I think a really important thing to say here is that, and I'm borrowing the words of the Queen, Arundhati Roy, another world is not only possible, she is on her way. Compassion builds her. And so I think it's so important that we move forward with compassionate politics. It is really, really important. And I think what are some, I'm saying all of this, but what are the practical things that we actually can do? And I think the first thing that you can do is a compassion audit. And this sounds hella serious, but it doesn't have to be I'm going to sit down with my journal and write my thoughts down. It's definitely something that you can do this audit in conversation with someone that you really want to have this conversation with, whether, you value, respect, or trust them. It can be a conversation. It can be how serious or unserious you want it to be. But as long as you're asking yourselves the question, like, what drains me, what nourishes me, and then also curating your feed like a garden, like, do the weeding, girl. Like, think about what accounts you do and don't want to follow. Think about, it doesn't even have to be who you follow or who you don't. It could also be how much time you're spending online. And I think why it's really important to be aware of what nourishes you and what drains you is that you then have the agency to deal with those emotions. Because I think if you let social media or the system answer that question for you, for yourself, then it just leads to disconnection and this empathy recession that we're in. But if it's you are aware of what drains you and what nourishes you, then you can take the appropriate actions to then make sure that you are looking after yourself, but also making sure that you're still feeding that empathy and that compassion, which I think social media and the algorithm stamps out if you don't answer for yourself or don't notice for yourself what is draining you and what is nourishing you. I think another thing that's really important, and again, it doesn't have to be like, all of this sounds like therapy talk, but it doesn't have to be like this big deal of like, let me hold space for myself so then I can really take time to sit with this. Because I feel like, I don't know, it doesn't have to be that deep. But I think if there is something that is then, like, if there is something that is violent or unsettling to see, I think it's really important to take a pause before you just keep on scrolling. Just naming what is it that you're feeling, and asking yourself, like, what is true, what preserves my humanity, what preserves the humanity of whatever it is that I am seeing at the moment. Because the moment when content or videos or images like this is desensitized to us, there is like zero sense of humanity. And I think it's really important that we don't allow that to happen. Because as soon as people or communities are dehumanized, there's zero empathy or curiosity or compassion. And I think it's really important that we humanize people and communities and just essentially everyone, because when we are having conversations about, I don't know, just literally anything, but it's coming from that space of, a certain community or a certain person has been dehumanized, that conversation is not going to be honest. It's not going to be fully realized, because if you're dehumanizing people, what are you running off? Stereotypes, rigid identities. It's not a fully realized conversation when that happens. And I think another thing that is also really important to foster when it comes to compassionate politics is thinking about, I'm not here to say that there is no room for social media when it comes to activism. It definitely has its value and it has a role to play. But it's very easy for activism on social media to be a public performance. And because the algorithm just rewards things that produce strong emotions, it doesn't allow space to think about, what is the impact of this? And so because it's such a slippery slope, I think it's important in 2026 and beyond that we prioritize private care over public performance. And so what does this private care look like? It looks like supporting neighbors in your community and supporting local organizations and getting behind local kaupapas. It looks like mutual aid. And I think, again, this is not to say that social media doesn't have its place, but if we as a collective are able to prioritize private care more than public performance, then, I'm not here to say that this is exactly what will happen, but whatever happens will go much further than the impact of like posting black squares and hashtags. And I think it's really important that we practice empathy, and I'm talking about empathy grounded in justice, not this sense of sentimentality. Like we want to empathy that refuses dehumanization, I think, is the kind of empathy that leads to compassion and curiosity. And that's something that I think we have to be so aware of. And I think that's why I was saying earlier, like it's so important that we are aware of what drains us and what nourishes us. And just to be very aware of our responses, because being aware of those things, it will tell us if our empathy is being grounded in justice and not sentimentality. Because if your empathy is grounded in sentimentality, it will be biased. It's saying, these are the people who I care about, or I feel I will respond more strongly to. And the system tells us who we should and shouldn't care about. So it's really important that our empathy is grounded in that justice. I think also another important thing is protecting emotional labor, because boundaries are political, rest is political. Essentially, everything is political. So I think it's really important that we all protect our emotional labor. And I think the last thing that I'll say about fostering compassionate politics is staying curious always, because certainty closes doors, but curiosity always opens doors. And the way that our world is at the moment, it is so important that we keep those doors open. And I think the last thing that I really wanted to emphasize as well when it comes to talking about compassion and empathy is that the work of care itself is quite a lot. Because, everything that we've been talking about this episode, empathy and relational activism, it is labor, it is emotional labor, it is moral labor, it is political labor. And in 2026, that labor is revolutionary. Because if you really think about it, when you spend time listening or supporting someone quietly, you are interrupting the dominant economy of outrage. You are saying, without hashtags or the viralness thing that happens online a lot, is that human connection matters more than clicks. But that emotional labor is undervalued and extremely taxing. Psychologists have found that people who engage consistently in care work, whether it's mental health advocacy, it's activism, community support, face higher risks of burnout, anxiety, and depression. But I think culturally, this work is kind of framed as soft, as invisible. And I think we all need to understand that this kind of work is transformative love. It's and when you think about what is transformative love, it is an act of care, it is disciplined, it is intentional, it is persistent, and it's that kind of transformative love that builds the new worlds quietly and the new systems quietly. And it's so easy to just think about that outrage, but I feel like it's the emotional labor that's really undervalued. Like if you think about the grassroots Black Lives Matter organizers, the viral outrage, especially in 2020, it is and it was fleeting, but people spend years mentoring youth, rebuilding that trust, doing the legal and social support work, and that is the slow, invisible, radical labor of care. And so I think the radical part of it is choosing to do care work is political. And why is it political? Because it runs against the grain of a world that rewards spectacle, immediacy, and performance. The radical thing about care work is that it's a refusal of the outrage economy, and the radical thing about it is that care work and doing that emotional labor, what it's saying loud and proud is that life, nuance, and human dignity are worth sustaining, even when the world feels indifferent. And so I think it's really important that, the next time you're just feeling hella exhausted or disengaged from the scroll or from the outrage, from the endless crises, this is the moment to pause. Just think about, how am I feeling in this moment? Have I become desensitized? Have I dehumanized? What is the care that I can do and give without it needing to trend at this moment? What questions do I need to be asking myself? Where does my curiosity take me? What conversations could I be having? What actions could I be doing from this? And I think that quiet labor of empathy is revolutionary. And I think the more that we practice as a collective, the more that we do it on a relational level, the more that we practice it deliberately, persistently, I think the more that we build communities that can withstand cycles of outrage, fatigue, and despair. And I think that is so important if we think about the world that we're living in now, because it's only been almost a month of 2026, but it's a lot. The world just feels a lot right now. We're living in a time where extremism is rewarded, anger, outrage is rewarded. There's no space for compassion or humanization, and that's so dangerous, because when we get into the space, there's no curiosity. Identity becomes rigid. We are rewarded for certainty. And I think it's so important to turn to compassionate politics and not just turn to it in a way where it's this is a value. It's it needs to become a practice, because in a world that demands our attention, that relies on us just scrolling, which relies on us becoming desensitized and dehumanizing others, it just feeds this us versus them. There's no room for nuance, for those hard conversations, for those contradictions to be held at the same time. But compassionate politics is, it's not rewarded because it is quiet. But if we practice compassionate politics consistently, it can be very, very reparative. And I think that's so important that we invite that into our lives, especially in a year where, we're going to have an election later on. And I think, regardless of how you feel about the current government, the actions of this current government have kind of opened up a can of worms that we really do need to talk about, which is about our race relations here in Aotearoa. But it's opened that can up in a way where it's like incited like culture wars. And I think those conversations would look very, very different if we all practiced compassionate politics. And I think that is my radical invitation for all of y'all for this year and beyond, is to practice compassionate politics in your world. Thank you for tuning into another episode of Headscarves and Good Yarns, and catch you for the next one.
Thank you for tuning in into another episode of Headscarves and Good Yarns. To keep spinning the yarns, let us know your thoughts. You can find us on Facebook and Instagram at Headscarves and Good Yarns, or email us at headscarvesandgoodyarn@gmail.com.
This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On Air.